Every sunrise an empire risked famine to place warm bread inside tombs where no breath remained, convinced a single missed offering could unravel the sun itself. Follow that loaf past the stone door, and the silence behind it will tell you why the living feared an empty plate more than death. They brought bread to mouths that could no longer chew. They poured wine for tongues turned to dust. They laid honeyed figs beside ribs that knew only silence. And they did it every dawn, every dusk, across lifetimes, feeding graves, feeding memories, feeding fear. You and I have learned to see a cemetery as an endpoint, a quiet closure, the final full stop after the sentence of life. In the Nile country, that closure never arrived. Death began a second appetite. Relatives baked loaves shaped like miniature sun disks and carried them past the desert wind into limestone chambers. The loaves hardened quickly, yet the offerings kept coming. No one spoke of waste. Waste meant revolt. Waste meant unrest among those who had already crossed the western horizon. Sand slipped through fingers, oil lamps flickered, and the living leaned close to carved stone faces. They whispered the secret words that turned stale grain into spirit grain, dull beer into spirit beer. Priest scribes called this the opening of the mouth, a magic that unlocked a body already locked away. Mouthless, the departed still must swallow. Breathless, they still must sigh. The ritual said so. The kingdom depended on the ritual, and the kingdom endured because no one dared to test the opposite. Imagine the heat inside one of those tombs. The smell of palm oil, the faint sweetness of date cakes, the sharp mineral note of freshly cut limestone. Statues stared with lapis eyes, while real eyes watered from the smoke of incense. A girl named Iriket knelt beside her father's sarcophagus, her knees pressed against ochre dust. She set down the bread she had prepared before sunrise, bread she would never taste, bread that cost more than her own supper. She brushed the stone lid as if it were skin. Then she waited, listening for silence to sound like gratitude. No mouth, no stomach. Still, bread, no pulse, no breath. Still, the promise of supper. Such was the measure of devotion along the river that made its own seasons. Flood, sow, harvest, live, die, feed. The cycle moved in concentric rings, and the smallest ring was a single household repeating the gesture of generosity toward a world they could not see but dared not neglect. Travelers from northern islands arrived centuries later and laughed. They saw desiccated loaves piled like bricks, jars of wine long evaporated, bouquets of onions wrapped in linen. They called it superstition, called it childish, called it the madness of a people drunk on sunlight. They did not see the terror under the sunlight. They did not understand hunger as a cosmic law. They never stood in a night so black that the Milky Way resembled a river of souls drifting overhead, each soul whispering one word: hunger. The paradox sits heavy. A civilization that engineered obelisks taller than cedar trees also invested its wealth in meals for cadavers. Grain taxes, labor quotas, shiploads of herbs, all redirected to the necropolis. Why? The word hangs like dust motes in a shaft of morning light. Why bend backs and budgets to sustain a banquet no guest can physically attend? The answer hides where breath fades. The answer hides where memory outweighs muscle. The answer hides in fear of neglect, fear of cosmic imbalance. Think of the simplest meal you ever shared. A crust of bread, a sip of water. Now imagine stretching that grace across centuries, layer upon layer of descendants kneeling where the first mourner knelt, each believing the crust passes through stone into another dawn where their loved ones wait. That stretch of faith formed the backbone of pyramids and the whisper of every village kiln. This is not a legend. Archaeological crews have traced fingerprints in the clay of those untouched loaves. Hair fibers remain in the linen that wrapped last night's onions. Wall paintings depict servants handing ladles to silhouettes whose bodies glow yellow, the color reserved for beings of the unseen realm. The paintings are older than the iron nails in your front door, and they speak in the present tense. Close your eyes for a moment. The bayou hush of cicadas fades. You stand under a sky whose constellations bear no names you recognize. The air smells of warm stone. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, crocodiles slide between reeds. Behind you, torches hiss. Before you, silence expects its serving. You remember the faces of parents, grandparents, children. They are gone, yet you feel their palms open, waiting. You lift the basket. Bread, onions, beer. You step inside. This is the threshold. Cross it, and the past eats with you. Refuse, and the past eats at you. Feeding the dead may sound absurd, yet the practice endured longer than many empires even dreamed of enduring. Century after century, generation after generation, the living bowed to the invisible hunger and offered their harvest to a world beneath the sand. Bread hardens, wine dries, stories remain. Keep listening. This is only the beginning. They called her Iruket, a name that sounded like a reed flute catching the river wind. The village scribes etched it once upon a potsherd and then forgot, yet the echo still walks through the sand. Iruket lived in the fragile shade of mud brick walls, barely half a morning's walk from the western cliffs, where the dead kept their addresses. She woke before first light, because bread for 2 worlds needed many hours. She ground emmer grain on a basalt slab until her shoulders burned, poured water drawn in clay jars from the river, coaxed a dough to breathing thickness, then set it under woven mats to rise while the sun climbed. Bread for the living would wait. Bread for the silent could not. The death of the baker had come suddenly. One flood season, he hurried between kiln and market, slipped on river mud, and the back of his head met the paving stone. No spell of Isis could lift him again. Undertakers ferried him west that very evening. They packed natron into every hollow, wrapped the limbs in linen, placed 2 scarabs over the chest, slipped a wooden figure shaped like a hoe beneath his fingers. Work waited beyond the western gate, and the figure promised service in eternity. When the stone door sealed, morning dew still clung to palm leaves. Iruket was 15 summers when the tomb closed. A girl old enough to braid her own hair, too young to argue with eternity. She prayed on her knees until the woven mat left its pattern on her skin. Her brother Mutu tried to comfort her, promising offerings during festivals, promising to stand in their father's place at harvest. Mutu wore courage like a borrowed cloak, bright on the outside yet thin beneath. 3 moons later, soldiers drafted him for the northern frontier, and Iruket never saw him return. She learned grief by counting absences. There were mornings, seasons before the accident, when father and daughter stood ankle-deep in river silt, scooping clay for new baking trays. He told her the river cared for every soul the way yeast cared for dough, lifting it unseen, making it lighter than it knew. He sang work songs in a voice rough with smoke, and she tried to match his pitch, though her throat was still childish. They ferried the clay home, kneaded it, fired it until it rang like a dull bell. Those pans survived longer than the throne names carved on palace door lintels. His teaching settled in her muscles. 2 handfuls of flour, 1 of water, a pinch of wild yeast captured in a jar of figs. Stir until the dough feels like the hide of a newborn goat. Fold, rest, fold again. She whispered the rhythm under her breath. Fold, rest, fold, until it became a hymn. Palms, not parchment, kept the recipe. Years slid by in rings of floodwater on the courtyard wall. Every 8th day, Iruket and her mother crossed the river at dawn. Baskets of palm fronds held small round loaves, onion bulbs, a jug of beer, sometimes a single pomegranate when the season was kind. The ferry pole touched silt, pushing them into slow current, and the east bank receded until the painted pylons of Amun looked like seashells. On the west bank, the necropolis greeted them with a silence loud enough to tremble in the chest. The tomb door bore 3 carved symbols: a loaf, a jug, an arm bent in gift. Offer, offer, offer. Iruket knelt and set each loaf upon the low stone altar. She spoke the words taught by the priest. Bread of the horizon, beer of the sky, may your throat never thirst. She never mislaid a syllable. When she finished, she inhaled the odor of dust and dried natron, listening as though walls might thank her. They never did. She swept crumbs from the stone with her fingers, tucked a lotus petal behind her father's ear carved in paint, and withdrew. By midday, heat quivered over the loam fields. Iruket fired her home kiln to bake bread for living mouths, loaves shaped like broad anks with a slit in the crossbar, easy to break and share. Buyers arrived from nearby estates, paid in copper shards or barley sacks. Copper vanished into temple tax. Barley became the next offering. The cycle spun without slack. Sometimes the overseer of grain passed by, counting her loaves and coins, reminding her that royal storehouses demanded fixed quotas. She nodded, hiding calloused fingers beneath her sleeves. No overseer measured the weight of devotion. Night brought hush, but not rest. Cicadas sang the measure of darkness. Iruket mended baskets, patched her mother's cloak, stirred ashes that still glowed red. She pictured her father seated at a turquoise table somewhere past the western horizon, reaching for shapes of bread drifting like clouds. She imagined him smiling each time she named him in prayer, because a spoken name is a borrowed heartbeat. She feared the dawn she might oversleep and leave him hungry among stars. During flood exile, when her village camped on higher ground and fields drowned under layers of silt, she baked in a portable pit lined with brick shards. Travelers from the delta watched, amazed that a girl managed perfect sunloaves without an oven dome. She broke the crust, steam spiraled, strangers paid with shell bracelets. She saved one bracelet, blue as twilight, and tied it to her father's coffin handle on the next visit, payment from worlds he never saw. The festival of the valley came each spring, when the gods sailed west to visit the silent. The city followed, rattling sistrums, chanting hymns that scraped throats raw. Torches lined the causeways like burning threads. Iruket adorned her braids with an ivory comb from her grandmother, painted eyelids with crushed malachite, though the price pained her. The procession crossed the river beneath a full moon, and every cry of the crowd felt like a drum inside her ribs. Inside the chamber, she spread a linen cloth, placed a roasted goose, arranged onions in a crescent, poured beer into a faience cup. Her mother stood behind, lips trembling without sound. Old stories warned that spirits could borrow the living's hands. Iruket kept still. If her father needed her fingers to lift the cup, she would offer them. They lingered until crowds outside melted into dusk. Leaving, she glanced back. Torchlight rippled across painted figures, and for a breath, an eye seemed to blink. Perhaps it was smoke, perhaps faith. She walked on without speaking. Seasons shifted: flood, sowing, harvest. 1 year locusts devoured barley heads. Granaries echoed hollow. Iroquet ground lotus root, mixed it with the last wheat, shaped loaves no larger than a dove's heart, placed them in the tomb, with an apology whispered through cracked lips. On the path home, she fainted beside an acacia stump, waking under a sky throbbing with insects, certain for a heartbeat she too had crossed into Shadowland. Rising, she kept walking, tasting dust and determination. The ritual fed her, even as it burdened her. Every offering gave weight to her spine, proof she remained a daughter, though the state reduced her family name to numbers on a tax scroll. Identity lived in the scent of baking, the smear of dough on elbow, the steady ache of wrists wielding a paddle. Other women married, bore children, traded gossip at the well. Iroquet married the kiln. Her children were loaves, fragile, fragrant, destined for silence. She felt no envy, only a wavering tenderness toward the laughter she heard beyond her courtyard. One midwinter, a scribe from the capital arrived to audit taxes. He noted the volume of bread moving toward the necropolis and demanded extra levy, claiming the dead produced no profit. Iroquet stood in the doorway, flour dust rising from her apron, and answered in a voice she scarcely recognized. Bread keeps the flood honest. Bread keeps the sun on its path. Bread feeds the lips that name the monarch before Ra at dawn. Deny bread to the dead, and you gamble with daylight. The scribe left without further argument. One cold dawn, her mother failed to rise. Breath rattled once, then hushed. Iroquet washed the body, combed gray hair, wrapped her in linen scented with blue lotus. Undertakers asked whether she wished a chamber beside the father. She said yes and paid with the deed to her house. She moved into the storeroom behind the kiln, sleeping on sacks of chaff. The ferryman saw her cross the river with 2 baskets instead of 1. Bread for father, bread for mother. Baskets grew lighter with every drought, yet her steps never slowed. Time carved grooves in her cheeks deeper than the mason's chisel on the coffin lid. Villagers forgot her given name and called her the feeder. Children dared one another to follow her halfway across the necropolis before fear turned them back. She heard their laughter and kept walking. Solitude wrapped around her like linen, but she wore it with quiet pride. Voice softened, knees cracked. The prayer remained exact. Midsummer noon, cicadas screaming. The royal steward arrived with soldiers. Decrees demanded private kilns for state grain. Iroquet watched hammers seal her kiln mouth, heat bleeding away like the last breath of a hearth god. Dough waited on a board, rising in vain. She asked the steward whether the dead were exempt. The steward laughed. Bread served no ledger once entombed. The soldiers marched off, leaving silence louder than before. She shaped the half-risen dough into small rounds, wrapped them in wet cloth, placed them in a wicker tray, and ferried across the river under a sky bleached white. At her father's tomb, she unwrapped the dough, pale and trembling. She set each loaf upon the altar, smoothing them into a circle like a newborn sun. They would harden by dusk, become rock, become symbol, become sustenance where decay held no power. Voice of flower, voice of life, enter the quiet mouth, she murmured until her throat ached. She stepped outside into sunset. Cliffs bled crimson shadow. The river ran like molten bronze. Her legs shook. She knelt on the sand, hands empty. For the first time in 30 years, she wondered whether bread alone could carry love. She remembered her father's laughter when dough stuck to her elbows, her mother's song about the sower and the swallow. Memory tasted sweet. Memory was bread. She had been feeding them memory as surely as grain. In later months, she bartered needlework for loaves baked by others. Some were coarse, some bitter. She carried each with humility to the tomb. Winter chilled the valley. Her joints stiffened. Still, she walked. Hair gray as river mist, spine bent like a reed in north wind. She whispered the names. Names kept pulse. One dawn, she never reached the river. Neighbors found her seated beside the cold kiln, hands folded, face peaceful. The physician said the heart had ceased softly, like a lamp guttering when oil is spent. They ferried her west the next dawn. No kin remained to pay for cedar or limestone. The priest recited brief words and lowered her into an old communal shaft. Sand covered her like wheat covers a plowed field. Ceremony ended. Something lingered. A week later, a child chasing lizards near the baker's tomb found a small round loaf, perfectly shaped, resting on the threshold. The crust felt warm, though sunrise was new. He placed it back, uneasy. No footprints marked the sand. Villagers whispered that night. Some said the father had risen to feed the daughter in return. Some said the mother's devotion had hardened into bread. Some said the gods were reminding them that promises endure beyond breath. Years turned palace walls to rubble, dynasties to footnotes. A rock slide swallowed the tomb, sealing inside 3 baskets of offerings and the dust of devotion. Millennia passed. Travelers pried open the broken doorway. They found rows of loaves fused to stone, each bearing a faint thumbprint. They cataloged the relics and shipped samples to a distant museum. A curator studied the marks under glass and said the prints belonged to someone who baked with urgency, someone small of hand and stubborn of will. Some nights, when museum lights dim, the air smells faintly of warm wheat. Guards blame the cafe ovens. They do not know the ovens stand cold. A woman's name, mispronounced, mislabeled, still hums between glass cases. Iruket. Reed flute in the wind. The guards circle the hall. The air sweetens. Bread remembers. Bread remembers. Beer remembers. The hands that kneaded, the vows that bound. The dead do not starve while memory bakes in the living. The living do not vanish while the print of their touch stays on a crust. Love fires hotter than any kiln, and ash becomes seed when the season answers. The river keeps its flood. The cliffs keep their silence. And somewhere in that hush walks a girl with baskets, always dawn, always offering, always enough. The river runs high, and the drums grow louder. It is festival season again, and every village, every estate, every palace prepares 2 tables instead of 1. The first stands in the open air, with figs and fish still warm from the grill. The second waits behind limestone, far from sunlight, spread for mouths that cannot taste, yet must never be allowed to thirst. No one calls this a burden. They call it keeping the balance, and balance means survival. From the northern delta to the mines beyond the cataracts, a single idea binds clay huts and golden courts. The dead must eat. The living must serve. What began as a small family vow has ballooned into the heartbeat of an empire. You can feel it in the tax records engraved on stelae beside irrigation dikes. Grain from every harvest travels not only to granaries, but also to necropolises whose avenues stretch farther than the avenues of the living. Bread rations for priests, beer rations for tomb guards, honey and oil for the intangible guests who arrive nightly without footprints. The state builds roads so that wagons of offerings reach burial cliffs on time. Armies escort the processions. Hunger is the enemy. Hunger could wake the silent. Watch the royal city at dusk. Torches flicker along the harbor. Barges piled high with cattle and onions glide westward, the animals low in terror, smelling the shore of silence. Musicians beat frame drums to drown the fear. At the landing ramps, stewards stamp each crate with ochre seals that read, "Good for eternity." They march the supplies through gate after gate until the valley itself looks like a market at new moon, noise and scent swirling under the shadow of pyramids that already outdate every votive lamp in the crowd. For one night, the boundary dissolves. The living step inside death and call it duty. In the banquet hall, carved deep beneath the cliff, slaves heave bronze cauldrons onto alabaster counters. Steam rolls along painted walls where the pharaoh is forever young, forever victorious, forever about to taste roast goose. Real goose crackles on spits. Spiced wine drips onto the floor. A lector priest chants syllables older than copper. His voice rises and the steam shivers. An acolyte sprinkles natron over platters, sealing the boundary between rot and divinity. The guests of flesh wipe sweat from their brows, yet dare not complain. They know any sound might be taken for disrespect. They imagine eyes behind the painted eyes, teeth behind the carved smiles. Once the chanting ends, the court officials back away, leaving the food in perfect arrangement. They have 100 heartbeats to exit before the stone door drops. Behind that door, a banquet begins, or so the story must remain. If a dish spoils, priests fault their own syllables, never the appetite of a mummy. They retrace the spell and repeat until the odor fades. Eternity tolerates no sourness. Step outside the valley and follow the ridge to where the poor bury their own. A trench dug by 8 men, a reed mat, a thin mask of plaster, and above it a crude slab of mud brick. No hieroglyphs, no gold leaf, yet the rule persists. Every 8th day, someone returns with flat cakes, spring water, maybe a sliver of dried perch. The cakes sit in broken bowls. The water evaporates. Dogs sniff and turn away. Still, the offering returns the next week and the next, because neglect would doom the soul to hunger. A pauper cannot afford limestone, but he can afford faith. Iruket feels the chasm widening each time she crosses paths with the royal convoys. Their wagons thunder past, wheels wrapped in leather, oxen decorated with gilded horns. She steps off the road into dust, so their shadows never touch her basket. Yet guilt follows her anyway. Her father's tomb lies modest, his chamber barely a crawl space, his altar a single shelf. She leaves 3 small loaves and wonders whether 3 are enough. She knows the pharaoh behind the ridge receives 300 on the same morning. The valley whispers an ugly truth. Inequality survives burial. Privilege grows thicker in the dark. Priests claim they can level the scales with words. They stage nightly ceremonies called the Awakening of Sustenance. 2 torchbearers flank a low table stacked with symbolic meals sculpted from wax and clay. The high lector breathes over each object, naming it as if sculpting reality. He speaks the word for beef, and the wax glistens as though marbled with fat. He speaks the word for beer, and the clay jug sweats on its own. His acolytes gasp in choreographed awe. Patrons pay heavy copper for this service. Their relatives, already wrapped, cannot protest. Their stomachs open in the afterworld only if the priest pronounces each phoneme without error. This ritual spreads. Temples in frontier towns commission scrolls with phonetic guides so local priests can copy the miracle. Soon, every settlement boasts specialists in feeding the invisible. Tablets record fees, and the fees climb each flood season. Bread itself becomes cheaper than the breath that claims to transform it. Families pay anyway. They fear the day a priest misreads a sign and their ancestor wakes thirsty forever. That fear multiplies when rumors leak of hungry ghosts. Night watchmen at river docks say they hear gnawing from empty grain bins. A shepherd swears he saw handprints on the inside of a sealed tomb door, sticky with pitch yet dented inward. No one verifies the stories, yet no one sleeps easily. Town councils vote to raise the necropolis guards' pay. Gold flows into tomb security, while children beg for porridge along the quay. Hunger turns metaphysical, spreading like locusts through conscience. One midsummer dawn, the royal mortuary barge stalls at the harbor. Oars break, current spins the hull. Cargo lists. The hold carries crates of dried figs bound for the resting place of a queen who died decades earlier. Workmen panic. If the figs spoil under the sun, the queen might taste bitterness on the other side. The captain commands half the crew to leap into the river and push. They obey, muscles straining, water up to their necks, until the barge nudges forward again. One man vanishes in the churn. No one pauses to search. A single soul less weighs nothing beside the wrath of a royal shade left unfed. Word reaches Iroquet's village that another famine has struck the far south. Granaries stand hollow, yet the valley still demands tribute. Grain boats pass villages where women grind acacia pods for flour. Children chase the boats, shouting for scraps. The guards throw nothing. Offerings cannot be diverted. The gods would notice. Better to let living stomachs cramp than risk cosmic revolt. Priests send letters north, explaining that each loaf surrendered to a tomb becomes a pledge for next year's harvest. Until the fields recover, the living must endure emptiness so the future may swell with abundance. The logic tastes like sand, yet the villages swallow it. Whispers travel with caravans. A scribe from Thebes tells of a hidden section in the Book of the Dead, a spell that lets a poor man borrow the banquet of a rich one. All he needs is the right symbol traced on the wall of his tomb. Word spreads like wildfire. Potters now sell amulets boasted to bear the emblem. The marketplace rings with arguments over authenticity. Counterfeits flood alleys. Cheap clay dipped in lampblack. Authorities arrest peddlers, smash molds, but demand outpaces fear. Even in death, people bargain for leftovers. Tomb robbers thrive in the tension. They no longer chase gold alone. They seek jars of preserved goose, cakes flavored with pine resin, gourds brimming with honey. These delicacies fetch high prices in underground taverns, where desperate farmers trade what little silver they own for an edible blessing. Some claim a single bite wards off hunger for 7 days. Others claim the taste is foul, like meat smoked in pitch. Truth splits like dried papyrus. Rumor wins. Every theft sets off a new round of purification. Priests perform a rite of reclamation, sprinkling holy water over broken seals, chanting the names of each stolen item so the spirit of the food reappears. They insist the dead notice nothing, that the balance remains perfect. The living doubt. Anxiety thickens the air at dawn when mourners line the ferry docks, clutching baskets wrapped in reed fiber. They count offerings twice, thrice before boarding. A single missing onion could doom a soul. The raft pushes off, and the water around it bristles with crocodile backs glimmering like obsidian. Even the beasts seem hungry. The royal palace issues a decree. All tombs of minor officials shall henceforth receive standardized rations measured by scribes. No family may exceed the allotment. Excess belongs to the state, destined for temples where priests redistribute according to celestial need. The decree claims equality. In truth, it deepens the divide. Powerful families circumvent the rule by hiding extra food inside false bottom baskets or embedding wine into hollow statues. Guards pretend blindness for a price. Small households lack bribes and watch their altars shrink. Iruket adapts by weaving secret pockets into her cloak. She tucks a single fig here, a slice of lotus root there. Each contraband morsel feels like a rebellion against the machinery of eternity. She knows the risk. If caught, she would lose fairy privileges, perhaps worse. Yet the idea of her father, tasting only rationed bread, burns hotter than any punishment. She chooses fire over frost. Every crossing becomes a test of nerve. The guards weigh her basket, find nothing amiss, wave her onward. She exhales once the oar strokes settle into rhythm. Water slaps the hull like a slow heartbeat. On the far shore, she passes other smugglers. Some carry wineskins stitched inside blankets. Others braid beads of dried fruit into their hair, hoping priests mistake them for ornaments. No one speaks of the crime aloud. Eyes meet, widen, slide away. Complicity spreads like river mist. Even the guards must have relatives underground. Desire for justice bends under filial piety. The system trembles, though it still stands. Inside grander tombs, the disparity becomes grotesque. Sculptors carve entire kitchens from limestone. Ovens, ladles, trays, even the smoke rendered in raised relief. These carving kitchens feed the pharaoh forever. The priest walks by, mutters a spell. The depiction transforms into substance in the realm beyond. Meanwhile, in a pauper shaft, a lone reed mat and a chipped bowl must do the same duty. Priests claim the spell works equally on humble images. Yet they cannot hide envy when they enter the royal catacomb and smell cedar coffers brimming with foreign spices. Spices so rare that living kings taste them only during coronation. Envy breeds heresy. A novice lector, unpaid and perhaps intoxicated by incense, begins to question the fairness of feeding in perpetuity those who never farmed a single field. He speaks too loudly. Senior priests silence him under threat of exile. Yet the seed germinates. Some scribes start leaving gaps in the offering lists, blank lines where an item's name should appear. If read in the afterworld, the missing words manifest as hunger. They believe this sabotage balances the cosmic scales. They gamble with souls. Tension climbs further when a drought follows the famine. The Nile flood arrives low, leaving black silt only on the nearest banks. Beyond, the soil cracks and peels like burnt papyrus. Villages ration water, yet offerings still flow uphill toward stone doorways. Travelers, hauling jars past skeleton fields where rice sparrows peck at dust. Farmers curse, but keep lifting the ropes. They cannot let the dead suffer. They dare not risk the river failing altogether because some shade protests. At night, jackals slip through necropolis gates, sniffing for leftover goat fat. Their howls echo inside corridors, and guards tighten ranks. The animals remind everyone that hunger has teeth. A rumor spreads that jackals are the embodiment of Anubis, come to audit the offerings. Each howl means a lost basket. Merchants raise the price of goat tallow. Poverty forces substitutions. Beeswax stands in for fat, clay beads for raisins, salt water for wine. Priests insist symbolism remains intact. Skeptics taste dust and wonder how long faith can chew illusions. Yet illusions possess power. One dawn, a new statue appears in the courtyard of the great temple, carved from sycamore, painted with ochre lips, parted in gentle smile. The inscription claims the statue is the lady who gives bread. Worshippers line up carrying flat cakes. They press the cakes to the statue's mouth, then eat them themselves, convinced the bread now holds a blessing. For weeks, the market price of wheat drops because people feel full after a single bite. Hunger recedes. The statue achieves what royal decree could not. Authorities debate whether to sanction the practice. Priests fear their monopoly on feeding may crumble if wood and paint can grant the same comfort. In the midst of this turmoil, Iruquette's health falters. The cough she once ignored sharpens into knives. She cannot grind grain without gasping. Still she kneads dough at pre-dawn, hands trembling, lungs on fire, because skipping a delivery feels like betrayal. On the ferry, she wraps her cloak tight, hiding her shivers. Across the deck, a noble wife adjusts her perfumed wig. The wife's basket overflows with roasted quail and imported olives. Iruquette's basket holds 3 coarse loaves and a pinch of salt. Both women avoid each other's gaze. Both carry equal weight in love. Neither carries equal weight in privilege. When the priest opens the tomb for inspection, Iruquette watches from the shadows. Lamplight sweeps across paintings of her father and fields of reeds. She hears the priest mutter the renewal spell. The bread rises in the words, or so he claims. She wants to believe. She must believe. Yet doubt now whispers. What if difference in volume creates difference in afterlife? What if her father joins the queue of the unfed? The thought tightens her throat like rope. She walks home through rows of statues staring at nothing, each one more vital in stone than she feels in flesh. The next morning heralds another decree. The palace, desperate for resources, orders a freeze on non-royal offerings for the length of the drought. All barley must go to breweries that supply the army. All honey to medic tents. Bread for the dead will resume when the river returns to full crest. The announcement scrawls across town gates in vermilion ink. Mourners read, tremble, tear the notices down, but soldiers repost them. Temples echo with wails. Priests scramble for loopholes. Some suggest reciting the offering formula near an empty plate will suffice. Others advise burying symbolic loaves underground until the ban lifts. Panic seeds every corridor. Iruquette measures her flour jar and decides the decree cannot bind her heart. That night, she sneaks to the kiln ruins where the soldiers once hammered shut the mouth. She chisels away the plaster plug, relights the fire with dried reeds, and bakes 7 loaves, one for each decade of her father's imagined eternity. The flames lick the vault. Sparks fly into the sky. Constellations whirl overhead. She stands barefoot in the glow, hair smelling of smoke, eyes wet with fatigue and conviction. At dawn, she ferries the contraband across a misty river patrolled by sentries too cold to check cargo thoroughly. The tomb embraces the aroma. She arranges the loaves in a crescent, lips moving in the old prayer. The stone seems to soften. She feels a hand on her shoulder, though no one stands behind. Love or fever, she cannot say. She exits before the vision frightens her into immobility. On the path home, she meets other rebels. A fisherman carries dried perch hidden beneath net weights. A mason holds a jar of beer disguised as plaster slurry. Each nods once, eyes glittering with shared defiance. The band fractures under quiet footsteps and hidden packages. Rumor says even inside the royal palace, some servants risk punishment by slipping morsels under doorframes of sealed chambers. The dead queen receives clandestine smoked duck. The long-dead prince receives figs tucked in a crevice behind his sarcophagus. Duty subverts decree. Memory outmaneuvers law. Hunger bows to love and rises again as faith. Officials tighten surveillance. They stage surprise inspections at dawn. Guards smash pots, weigh baskets, sniff bundles of laundry. Iruket endures 3 searches in 1 week. Each time she passes because she hides offerings not on her person, but in the stories she tells. She recites genealogy, praises the pharaoh, distracts them while a neighbor slips her basket through reeds. Narrative as camouflage, words as shield. The system that believes in verbal power cannot suspect sabotage hidden in grammar. Some nights, however, sabotage cuts both ways. Heresy seeps into temple walls. A rogue priest writes a new spell that promises to starve any shade linked to tyranny. He slips the papyrus into the Book of the Dead, recited at noble burials. If spoken, the words "annal offerings," turning banquets to ash. When rumors of the text surface, nobles panic. They bribe lector after lector to double-check each ritual line. Prices for correct pronunciation skyrocket. Poor families cannot compete. They go on faith alone. The same faith that once united the valley now stratifies it further. The skies darken with dust. Another plague of locusts arrives, devouring what little grain survived drought. The living groan, clench empty stomachs, yet still the processions march toward tombs with token offerings. Soldiers now escort the convoys, partly to guard against bandits, partly to intimidate hungry villagers lining the road. The villagers chant curses under their breath. The air crackles with tension so thick that even the sun seems wary, dimming behind a veil of grit. One noon, a riot erupts at the river quay. Dock workers block a barge laden with cattle bound for necropolis priests. They demand the cattle feed their starving children instead. Soldiers form ranks. Stones fly. Spears answer. Blood spills on the plank path. The smell of slaughter turns the air metallic. A single cow breaks its tether and leaps into the water, vanishing beneath churning waves. Priests later declare the animal sacrificed to Osiris, restoring balance. Dock workers bury their dead in shallow graves before nightfall. The riot becomes another offering of flesh, unwilling yet useful. News travels fast. Villages barricade roads. Convoys reroute. Tensions not tighter. Yet even amid chaos, funerals proceed. A minor scribe dies of fever, and his colleagues pool copper to embalm him. They host a wake beside the river, sharing the last of their private beer. They place a basket of onions on his chest, believing onions strong enough to wake a numbed heart. The next dawn, soldiers confiscate the remaining beer but leave the onions. Even authority respects some boundaries. The scribe sails west with 2 coins and vegetables that make eyes sting. His friends believe the sting reminds souls to open. Priests gather in crisis councils under flickering lamps. They argue over doctrine. Should offerings cease during famine, or should they double to placate wrathful ancestors? Voices rise. A scroll catches fire. Sparks leap onto the reed mats. Flames race across the floor before acolytes smother them. Smoke blackened ceiling stars painted centuries earlier. The incident becomes omen. Some priests interpret it as warning that heaven itself chokes. They propose a radical fast, feeding neither dead nor living for 7 full days, believing the mutual hunger will reset the scales. Others call the idea madness, a path to collapse. Debate ends when the high lector collapses from exhaustion. Consensus remains elusive. Through it all, the painted scenes on tomb walls maintain impossible calm. Fields of reeds wave forever. Oxen pull plows along eternal furrows. Harpists play melodies without end. The facade denies earthly strain, and that denial deepens the ache. The living see paradise carved in color, yet feel ribs pressing through skin. They kneel by altars anyway, because abandoning the feedings would mean conceding that death might be blind after all, that prayers might echo into emptiness. Better to starve in hope than feast in nihilism. Iruket, frail as split papyrus, keeps moving. She trades a copper amulet of her childhood for a handful of millet. She grinds the millet with trembling arms, mixes it with river water, shapes thin wafers, dries them on a shard of sun-baked brick because her kiln lies cold. She stacks the wafers in her cloak and ferries west. The guard on duty is half asleep, craving shade. He waves her past. She steps onto the necropolis path as a sirocco wind rises, flinging sand like needles. She does not flinch. She murmurs the prayer over and over, letting syllables line up like stepping stones across a whirlpool. She reaches the tomb, slides inside, lights a wick. The flame shakes under the wind, sneaking through cracks. She lays the wafers on the shelf. They look pitiful. She adds one more item, something priceless, because breath is priceless. She exhales slowly against the wafers, gifting them the warmth of her lungs, the scent of her life. A pause follows. Silence expands. In the hush, she imagines the crackle of a mouth biting into grain. She smiles, tears burning. Hunger lifts for one heartbeat, then the wick dies. Outside, thunder growls from a sky choked with dust. No rain, only sound. The valley holds its breath, wedged between famine and revolt, between faith and fatigue. The scale wobbles. Somewhere in the palace, a clerk calculates rations for next moon, subtracting bread from living mouths, adding it to ledgers of the dead. Somewhere in a hovel, a woman chooses which child eats. Somewhere under limestone, a king rests on stone pillows, surrounded by banquets that never spoil. Open loops widen. Unease thickens. The river waits for its next swell. The desert waits for its next victim. The dead wait for supper. The living wait for a sign. Every loaf, every onion, every drop of beer hangs like a single grain on a cosmic balance arm. One breeze may tip it. One withheld offering may shatter the mirror between worlds. One bold act, or one careless lapse. And no one can say which will come first. Bread carved the first riddle. Archaeologists pried open a subsidiary shaft beside a forgotten queen and found an avenue of loaves stacked like bricks. Each bore the perfect imprint of braided dough, a soft twist at the crown where fingers had pinched it closed. Yet inside lay nothing that a human tongue could name as food. The oven heat had never kissed this bread. The mixture was mud, chalk, shredded straw, and a paste of desert clay so fine it glittered under lamplight. Form without flavor. Hunger baited with a mirage. Someone had kneaded semblance into substance, then sealed it behind a wall of prayers. Scribes walking with the dig team read the plastered spells overhead. They expected hymns to the gods, consolations for the tomb owner, perhaps a genealogy in neat columns. Instead, they faced recipes that were not recipes. Grind grain, add water, shape the sun, breathe the name, close the door. The word breathe repeated like a drumbeat. Somewhere between grout lines, the scribe realized the verbs mattered more than the ingredients. Mouths no longer needed yeast. They needed a syllable. Dough could be dust if the dust-absorbed breath spelled correctly. Dust as feast contradicted every lecture those scholars had delivered back home. Their textbooks praised Egyptian engineering, medical skill, mathematics. The same volumes dismissed magic as superstition. Yet in this chamber, the two modes fused like copper and tin. The architect, who measured angles with knotted rope, collaborated with the priest who measured consonants against the tremor of eternity. One built the oven of stone, the other built the oven of air. Together, they cooked a metaphysical banquet that starved biology while fattening memory. Further down the corridor lay jars of beer, sealed with fine limestone plugs. Chemists sampled residue. No barley sugars, no fermentation byproducts, only river sediment and powdered ochre. Yet the jar mouths bore gilded stoppers shaped like foam crowns. Implied froth, liquid rumor. A scholar whispered that the dead drank metaphor. Another answered that metaphor drinks the living as well. Silence followed, thick as honey that never existed. Old campfire legends claimed embalming priests sometimes tasted a royal vintage before the burial. But these jars could never have teased a living palate. They were theater props in a play attended by spirits alone. The living audience remained backstage, sweating in shadow, hoping their performance hit the right pitch. A mispronounced glyph could sour an afterlife. A missing breadcrumb could collapse a dynasty. Stakes bigger than starvation overshadowed tables where living infants cried for grain already pledged to the opposite shore. On the eastern bank, a ration list on Ostrakhan told a cruel story. 3 sacks of wheat for the temple bakery, 2 for the palace storeroom, 1 for the festival of lanterns, 10 for the necropolis, 10 dwarfed every other number. The dead ate the lion's share, while the living chewed reed pulp. Officials stamped the tally with the cartouche of the reigning king. Proof the imbalance was policy, not accident. Later scribes tried to soften the arithmetic by arguing that spirit loaves could multiply like rabbits in moonlight. Yet workmen still carried real grain uphill, sweating bronze droplets onto the stones. Multiplication began only after deprivation. The pyramid texts guarded the secret algebra. Their ink danced along corridor walls older than the nation itself. Utterance 420 exhorted the officiant to speak bread into existence, to speak beer into fizz, to speak roast ox into aroma. The command repeated the word speak a dozen times in one stanza, as though lungs were millstones, tongues pestles, sentences the raw flour of resurrection. No kneading described, no fire discussed. Heat came from voice, fire from grammar. Here lay the paradox. A culture renowned for mummifying flesh dismissed edible moisture inside tombs as a liability, yet insisted flavor could thrive on parchment vibrations. Archaeologists labeled the site a curiosity. The living labeled it caution. Every shovel of sand lifted away showed how far the valley would bend to keep illusions plump. Stone walls shouted a silent demand. Believe or the crops fail. Believe or the sun pauses at noon. Believe or the flood retreats forever. The threat held power because the Nile itself behaved like liturgy. Flood, sow, reap. The sequence resembled chant. Break the chant and mud cracks. The logic gnawed at foreign minds until they tasted dust in their throats too. Tombs therefore functioned less as dormitories than as factories within a cosmic supply chain. Raw materials entered as labor, taxes, carved prayers. Finished products emerged as stability, legitimacy, fear shaped into faith. Each sarcophagus became a loading dock where symbolic fat was shipped across the veil, and every shipment required invoices in ink. Failure meant audit by famine. Inside this machinery, the dead grew more expensive with each generation. Early mastabas showed modest pantries. Later pyramids boasted entire menus etched on walls: wild fowl, honey cakes, lotus stew, pomegranate wine, even when those items barely existed in the Delta provinces. Tomb owners demanded luxuries still rare for living nobles, as if eternity acted like an auction house where only extravagant bids secured comfort. The afterlife inflated faster than the grain market. Spirals of debt followed. Farmers mortgaged next year's barley to pay last year's funerary priest, and priests floated on tides of interest that never slept. One papyrus, faded but legible, recorded a trial in which a widow accused a lector of malicious omission. She claimed he skipped the hieroglyph for goose in her husband's offering litany. The lector defended himself by pointing to the goose carved on the chamber wall. The court ruled that sculpture alone could not satisfy appetite without the activating syllable. The lector paid damages. The widow hired another priest to revise the script, doubling the geese count in case the first omission lingered. 2 geese became 4 in text, though no feathers ever fluttered beneath the stone lid. The widow starved her remaining children that season, but her husband's soul feasted twice nightly according to the new decree. Contradictions multiplied. In a workman's village near the royal tombs, excavators found a communal bakery with charcoal remains of thousands of miniature sun loaves, real bread, perfectly baked, never delivered. The loaves showed bite marks from field mice, evidence of earthly decay. Yet on a plaster ostrakhan nearby, someone had drawn a cartoon of a mouse wearing a priest's headdress and holding a ladle. Scholars laughed, then paused. Was the doodle satire of offerings lost to rodents, or prophecy of a cosmos where the smallest appetite could masquerade as divine? One evening in the lab, a conservator analyzing pigments on a tomb, Relief discovered microscopic grains of spice imported from a desert beyond Syria. No written record mentioned such a spice in temple cuisine for the living. Only the dead seasoned their meals with that fragrant powder. The living chewed unflavored millet, but painted cinnamon halos around imagined stews. Luxury in stone, austerity in flesh. The backwards economy of eternity. Even currency bowed to the riddle. Some stelae listed exchange rates. So many debens of copper for a funerary priest. Twice that for a singer to recite the bread spell at dawn. Half again for a chorus at dusk. The price of voice eclipsed the price of wheat, rendering a harvest worthless without the complement of breath. Grain might sprout unbidden after Nile flood, but syllables required trained throats, temple training, social pedigree. Thus, the spiritual supply chain stacked hierarchies atop hierarchies until the echo of a chant weighed more than the sack that fed the chanter's children. Modern tourists stand behind velvet ropes and photograph the stone tables still crowded with clay breads and alabaster chalices. They read the plaques that explain symbolic sustenance, nod politely, move on to the next crypt. They miss the seismic tremor hiding in the explanation. If form can trump flavor, then faith can trump famine. If clay can nourish a ghost, then a ghost can drain a village. Inverted cause ripples forward in time, reaching food deserts on other continents, reaching factories where calorie counts outgun hunger pangs, reaching boardrooms where plastic models of entrees promote restaurants that throw away flesh after closing time. Tomb logic spreads like desert wind, sandblasting common sense into surrender. Back in Iroquet's century, the shift from edible to ineffable rewired every courtyard kiln. Bakers like her began producing twin batches, one fragrant, one false. The false loaves were lighter, cheaper, immune to mold. Officials favored them for state deliveries, citing long-term savings. The fragrant batch shrank. Families ate fewer slices at supper, fed more phantoms at dawn. Some mothers tried nibbling the clay loaves in desperation, gagged on grit, spat blood. Rumor blamed curses rather than silica. Superstition turned inhaled dust into divine retribution. Men died coughing, and priests performed rites to expel vengeful spirits, never suspecting silicosis. The switch pleased treasury scribes, but angered potters, because clay once reserved for storage vessels now vanished into mock bread. Quarrymen carved more calcite for altars. Masons built annex rooms to house the exploding inventory of symbolic meals. Cemeteries sprawled, pushing into farmland. Plow lines detoured around fresh shafts. When a farmer protested that his acreage shrank each season, officials advised rotating crops of cabbages in the cramped strips that remained. Cabbages required less sun, they said, and ghosts found the odor offensive anyway. Eventually, an overseer rationalized the living would adapt to smaller meals, while the dead remained magnificently provisioned, guaranteeing cosmic reciprocity. His memo disappeared into an archive. Rats nested in the scroll tubes. The overseer's own tomb, excavated millennia later, revealed dozen upon dozen of clay cabbages painted emerald green. No real cabbages survived to calibrate the color. The pigment flaked under modern halogen bulbs, releasing a faint whiff of copper and despair. Logic finally shattered one equinox when the temple bakery misread a docket and delivered real bread instead of clay replicas to a lesser noble's crypt. Days later, the crypt smelled of rot. Maggots writhed over offerings. Priests screamed blasphemy. Guards sealed the chamber and ran purification rites for 7 nights. The noble's descendants had already sailed north, unaware that one clerical error condemned their ancestor to eat decay until the end of creation. Panic rippled outward. Families demanded assurance that their tomb provisions contained 0 edible matter. Priests issued certificates of inedibility, stamped with blue paint derived from ground azurite. Counterfeits flooded the market again. Fear fed artisans more reliably than wheat. From that episode grew the final inversion. A slab from late dynasty decreed that truly holy bread must be utterly uneatable. If a single mouthful could warm a living belly, the loaf lacked purity. Tomb guardians began conducting bite tests, intentionally tasting offerings to ensure revulsion. Spit-stained crumbs sprinkled tomb thresholds like broken seals. The scene scandalized foreign travelers, who described it later as ritual cannibalism in reverse. Wrong perspective. The priests were not desecrating food. They were verifying value. Worth equaled waste. Treasure equaled trash. Only what no one could stomach deserved the honor of nourishing the unseen. Thus the axis flipped. Palaces banked on intangible banquets. Villages thinned, fields emptied, and still the river rolled, reflecting a sky where constellations marched in silence, eternal workings above a land that mortgaged its pulse to maintain that silence. Hunger for safety birthed a monster who ate symbols, and the monster devoured harvest after harvest, with the polite smile of clay bread refusing to crumble. Now stand back from the dig trench. Watch the work lights flicker over rows of mud lobes. Hear a scholar whisper that the ancients feared spoilage more than starvation. Another mutters that they feared forgetfulness even more. The line between fear and faith blurs until both look like twin faces on the same sarcophagus. One eye open toward earth, one toward void. Bread with form, history with hollow center, yet harder than basalt when belief dries inside. The paradox settles. You taste grit between teeth, though you stand miles from the excavation. You sense how the living bled for an aesthetic of permanence. You see tombs not as dormitories, but as assembly lines, manufacturing eternity out of dust and grammar. You understand, perhaps uneasily, that the dead demanded and the dead received, and in receiving, they indebted the breathing. Mummies became patrons. Priests became accountants. Farmers became mortgagees. Eternity became the most expensive banquet ever booked. And the bill still echoes through stone. Break the rhythm now, and the sun might stumble. Keep paying, and famine stalks the villages. The scales hang crooked, yet no hand dares lift the counterweight of clay bread. Such is the power of form without flavor, word without flesh, promise without harvest. Such is the hinge on which a civilization turned, creaked, and finally cracked into glory and ruin, both fed by loaves no living soul could hold down. Night gathers at the river's bend, and the water thickens with reflection. This is the hour when questions surface like fish gasping in moonlight, and every answer slips back under the current before the hand can close. You have followed Irkutsk's breadcrumbs through sun-baked alleys and echoing tombs. You have watched clay loaves eclipse real harvests. You have smelled the rot of a banquet meant to last forever. Now pause on the causeway between the living and the silent and ask, not how the rite persisted, not when it began, but why a mind would cling to it even as ribs showed through skin. Answers rise in layers, each truer for refusing to banish the others. Perhaps it began with terror. The valley's nights are wider than ours, horizons so clean they slice the sky open, spilling a million unfamiliar stars. Stand alone beneath that expanse, and the human skull turns echo chamber. Every memory of the dead growls back through bone. What if they resent the hush you have wrapped them in? What if they wake hungry and find you the nearest larder? Fear wears many masks: jackal, sandstorm, plague, but none so persuasive as the mask of your own mother forgotten. Better to deposit a loaf than to risk a knock from fingers you once held. Terror of revenge bakes itself into ritual until the fear feels like affection, until you kneel out of tenderness and rise convinced it was love all along. Yet terror alone cannot sustain millennia. Fear burns fast, devotion smolders. So picture a second engine, longing. A child like Iruket learns that stories grow thin when they travel only one direction. She brings bread to her father, not to silence his ghost, but to keep the conversation alive. The tomb becomes a post office without windows. Every loaf a letter no living scribe can read. She waits for a reply that never lands in her palm, yet always lands in her pulse. The hush feels warmer, the air steadier. Connection, however imagined, fills the chest where breath falters. In that warmth, she hears footsteps behind the wall, hears a voice shaping her name, the way stone tools once shaped wheat. Bread becomes a bridge no flood can wash away. When governments rise and temples crumble, bridges matter more than monuments. Now glide your lamp closer to the cliff face and see a steadier architecture, social order. Feeding the dead is also a ledger. Who supplies the grain? Who stores it, grinds it, ferries it, blesses it? Each step forges a chain of obligation that knots villages to estates, estates to temples, temples to the crown. A farmer can argue over taxes, but not over cosmic appetite. Priests translate that appetite into quotas. Scribes turn quotas into law. Guards turn law into stone. The ritual's beauty is its circular logic. Stability depends on obedience. Obedience depends on fear of imbalance. Imbalance can only be averted by stability. Step outside the circle, and you become a locust in human skin. Stay inside, and you may win a whisper of eternity, provided you pay on time. But circles can be drawn tighter, and power likes tight circles. Elites discover that ghosts speak loudest through voices hired by gold. A lector's syllables cost more than a loaf, so the poor bring bread, while the rich purchase thunder. Hieroglyphs bloom across limestone like currency notes, each stroke an interest payment on immortality. The hungry wait at quarry gates, staring at caravans of millet diverted to tombs. Officials tell them the gods will refund the sacrifice next flood. When the flood fails, officials blame an unnamed family that skimped on offerings. Guilt colonizes the empty stomach more easily than comfort. Thus, bread for the dead becomes a bridle on the living, tugging hearts toward compliance with reins woven from metaphysics. 4 readings, none canceling the others, each humming a separate chord in the same drone. Yet there is a 5th, quieter still. What if the rite is neither fear, nor love, nor tyranny, but memory learning to protect itself from erosion? Stone chips, papyrus fades, languages drown in their own descendants. A loaf, though, is the simplest story the hand can tell. Grain plus water plus fire equals life. Replace fire with prayer, and life escapes combustion. Every offering says, in crust and crumb, we were here, we cared, we feared forgetting more than hunger. A civilization that embalms bodies also embalms emotions, sealing them in the cool dark where rot slows. The banquet is a time capsule disguised as mercy. When strangers unseal it thousands of floods later, the fragrance is gone, but the gesture still tingles on the tongue. That tingle is the point. You may ask where Iriket stands among these theories. She would not split them. She would knead them together like 2 flowers until no sieve could sort them back. Listen. The night before her final crossing, she dreamt a corridor lined with open mouths, some human, some animal, some carved, some pulsing. Each mouth whispered a different demand. Feed me fear. Feed me blood. Feed me memory. She woke unsure whose voice she obeyed at dawn. She only knew the silence hurt less when bread rested on the stone shelf. Now tilt the lantern toward your own shadow. Feel how it lengthens against the limestone, even though you have not moved. That stretch is participation. By hearing her tale, you have slid 1 toe inside the necropolis economy. You have followed a loaf from harvest to hush. The question looms. If your father slept under sand, would you bear wheat across crocodile water? Would you mortgage tomorrow's dinner for the promise that someone, somewhere, still says his name? The answer cannot be rehearsed in comfort. It lives in the marrow of famine, in the weight of a basket before sunrise. Yet another doubt creeps in. Perhaps the rite was never about the dead at all. Perhaps the dead were an alibi for the living to practice generosity in a realm where gratitude could not disappoint them. Among neighbors, gifts breed envy. Among ancestors, gifts vanish into silence, leaving only the giver to glow. Bread for the dead might be bread for the self, baking virtue into act. If so, the costlier the gift, the brighter the glow, until clay loaves trick the conscience into believing it has outshone poverty. Who benefits? Temples, nobles, every institution that thrives when guilt keeps coffers open. But guilt wearies. When drought gnaws harder than dogma, even the pious flinch. Records from late dynasties list abbreviations beside names. Coded excuses exempting families from quota. Child sick, ox lame, roof collapsed. Margins grown under annotations. Debt postponed. Lien extended. The system bends, but refuses to snap, because bending keeps people inside the loop. Breakage would invite new gods with cheaper appetites, and no bureaucracy gambles on replacement theology. So the right endures by shapeshifting. Real bread yields to clay. Full baskets shrink to tokens. Priests license shortcuts. Speak the loaf instead of baking it. Mime the poor instead of fermenting it. The economy of scarcity spawns subsidized symbolism. From outside the circle that looks like progress, a lighter burden on farmers. From inside, it is escalation. Now even breath is taxed. Voice fractures under interest it never agreed to. And here the philosopher stirs. If a syllable costs more than a meal, has language itself become famine? Step back again. The tomb walls blur until they resemble a cinema screen. Pictures roll. Feasts, fields, music, lovers entwined. Every pleasure sharpened against forever. The living audience wants to buy tickets to that screening on the other side. The ticket price is perpetual catering. Yet once the projector starts, no one can prove the audience truly exists. The reel may spin for empty seats. Still, the living pay, because the darkness beyond the beam feels colder than debt. Mystery is a market with no refund window. Perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility. The banquet feeds nothing but the hunger for meaning. And meaning, once tasted, addicts more fiercely than wine. Strip the right of metaphysics, and you rob a farmer of the one leverage he owns against cosmic indifference. Leave it intact, and you bleed him grain. Which cruelty weighs heavier? Which mercy robs slower? No verdict arrives. The moon slides west, dragging star nets behind. Across the river, crocs grunt like drums. Iruket's tomb sleeps under rubble. Her clay loaves crumble atom by atom. Yet the fog of question she baked into each crust still drifts. You inhale it now. Feel the grit on your tongue. Choose an answer if you must, but know the loaf breaks into infinite crumbs, each one a theory feeding another mouth. Chew long enough, and every crumb tastes like sand transformed by story into sustenance, or story transformed by sand into doubt. Dawn yawns over the western cliffs. The ferry dock is empty. No reed baskets swing against a work-worn hip. No slight figure in smoke-scented linen waits for the oarsman's first stroke. Wind carries only dust and the thin cry of a kite circling high. The guard at the necropolis gate feels the absence before he sees it. One pilgrim less in the river's mirror. One footstep erased. Yet at the baker's low tomb, a loaf still rests. Pale. Perfect. Fresh enough that crust flakes at a finger's brush. Someone must have crossed in darkness, or earlier than the earliest bird. No footprints linger. Sand looks ironed flat. The guard swears the loaf was not there at sunset. He says nothing. He bows once, the old salute, and goes about his rounds. Silence keeps its secrets, and a secret is the safest cargo in this valley. Days lengthen, floodwater retreats. Heat presses grain fields into haze. Still a loaf appears at each rising sun. Some mornings too, shaped like joined hearts. Other mornings, a single wafer, thin as a sigh. Always the same thumbprint at the crown, small, stubborn. Villagers begin to speak of the feeder returned as shadow. They claim her devotion learned to walk without breath. They leave small strings of beads at the tomb door, half in reverence, half in barter for luck. A month drifts by. The guard begins leaving a cup of water beside each mysterious loaf. He feels foolish until the night jackals howl at the cliff face and then fall silent, noses high, as if scenting a presence older than bone. The next dawn, his water cup stands empty. Not spilled, drained. The loaf beside it remains untouched, flawless in cool daylight. He tells no one. Some truths bloom only in the chest. Across the river, the kiln ruins collapse in a dust storm. Villagers salvage bricks for hearths. Beneath the rubble, they find a single blue shell bracelet, unbroken, glowing like distant dusk. They carry it to the tomb and hang it on the door peg. The next morning, a third offering joins the 2 loaves, a fist-sized honey cake scented with lotus. The bracelet is gone. Wind leaves petals of flower around the threshold. The pattern forms a spiral, widening, widening, like breath released. Stories spread beyond the valley. Boatmen whisper of a tomb where bread never rots. A scribe from the royal city travels upriver to witness the marvel. He counts 7 loaves lining the shelf, each sealed with a name written in air. He walks out pale, refuses to share his notes, and orders a small clay figurine of a girl carrying a basket. He seals it in his own future coffin. Bread for the guide across the unknown, carried by a name he never spoke aloud. Night after night, the cliff glows faint blue, a foxfire shimmer, as though the bracelet still sings in a pitch below hearing. Local farmers leave handfuls of grain near the ferry moorings. Grain for the unseen hands that bake by starlight. One season of famine softens. Yields rise, though the flood remains modest. Priests claim new rights. Villagers nod, knowing the true chant rides on unmarked wind. If this journey has pressed a finger to your heart, if the dust of old ovens feels warm in your palm, subscribe. Here we breathe life into names the world allowed to crumble. Years nod into decades. The guard grows stooped, his beard salt white, but his torch still lights the same path. Loaves continue. He never sees the baker, and yet he feels her. A hush between heartbeats. The hush teaches him patience, teaches him to place his own share of barley on the shelf each solstice. No decree orders him. No ledger records his offering. Memory alone signs the account. One winter dawn, the guard does not wake. Fellow sentries carry him west. They cremate him on a small pyre, sprinkle ash into the river. That night, a loaf and a cup of beer stand on his old watch post. No one claims them. The beer smells of fresh malt. The crust bears a deep thumbprint, a larger one than the rest. Perhaps gratitude has size. Perhaps absence leaves room for a wider touch. Time thins like parchment. Dynasties topple. New gods march in, arguing fresh treaties with the horizon. The tomb slips under drifted sand, but the bread keeps rising, buried yet unspoiled, warm in ways stone cannot measure. Centuries later, when pickaxes open the chamber and electric lamps flare against painted walls, excavators gasp at rows of loaves paling in the beam. They tag, they bag, they send to labs, yet one loaf refuses to fit a label. Its crust stays soft. Tests find no yeast, no grain, only traces of river silt, wood smoke, and breath. Breath fossilized. Science writes inconclusive on the report. The loaf rests now behind glass in a city across the sea. But some nights, Guards smell warm wheat as they patrol dark halls. They blame the cafeteria ovens. The ovens sleep cold. They fed the dead so the future would never empty. They learned that what eyes fail to see can hunger harder than flesh and live longer. If memory feeds you too, write in the comments, "I do not forget."